Hey you guys, welcome to my tutorial on these chickens. I'm doing this as a commission for my neighbor. She saw my rooster painting and said, oh, I need a painting of my chickens. So this is going to be one of my next projects. So let's get started. So I started this painting a little differently than I usually do, which I started on dry paper, and I usually start on wet paper. And what I wanted to do with these chickens is to kind of incorporate them in the background by having the grasses growing in front of them. And I could have masked out the grasses, but I decided not to. I decided to paint them first, and then the idea was to paint around them, and it worked. But I think it would have worked better to mask them out. So if you do this painting, I would suggest that you mask the grasses out. But I used the grasses as a compositional element to kind of point in and towards the chickens to help the viewer's eye guide, to help guide the viewer's eyes into the painting and towards the chickens. And you can look, if you look at the grasses, it's like they're pointing where the viewer's eye should look. So the colors that I used for the grasses include Winsor green gold, permanent green light, sometimes a little bit of burnt sienna just to gray it down a little bit, but I wanted to keep these grasses looking fresh and green, so the permanent green light was perfect for that. And I tried to paint each blade of grass a different color. Like at the tip of the grass, it would be lighter. In the middle of the grass, it would be darker, and so on and so forth, just so that it's not one flat color. It makes the grass look a lot more interesting if you use one or two or three different colors in the grasses. And then underneath each chicken, I tried to paint the grasses wet into the chickens, so they kind of merged and melted into the chickens for all the grasses except those grasses that I had painted over them that I was then going to negative paint around, if that makes sense. Probably not. Anyway, so here I'm painting the middle chicken. I'm using a combination of quinacridone gold, burnt sienna, and if I want it to be a darker, more brown color, I added ultramarine blue. And I'm using a rigger here, and right here I'm painting on dry paper just to keep those dark ridges of feathers delineated nicely in the chicken. And I left plenty of white areas in the chicken's feathers and bodies at this point, just to give myself that option later in the painting to have little sparkles of white everywhere on the chickens. And I did go later and calm some of those white spots down. You don't want to over jewelrify your painting, but I did leave some white spots, and then I painted over others. But I like the idea of leaving white spots and then deciding later on in the painting if they look good, because it can really add sparkle to a painting to have pure white areas in the painting. And so whenever you see me painting a really, really dark passage here, usually it's going to be ultramarine blue and burnt sienna and in a cream consistency so that it's really thick. And then for a lot of areas of this painting, I wanted the edges of the chickens to melt into the background so they don't look pasted on, so it looks more loose and painterly. So a lot of times I would be painting the chickens, and then I would paint at least part of the background right up to the chickens, so those two edges met and melted together to give the chicken a really soft paint. And then here I'm painting the back of the middle chicken, and I'm using a tea to milk consistency, and you can see it melting right into the background of the chicken, and the back of the chicken melts right into the background. And I definitely wanted that effect because I really think it makes a nice soft effect. And I left a couple little white bits of paper in the V of her back, and that helps kind of delineate where the chicken is. And you always want to think in terms, when you're trying to paint loose, you want to think in terms of suggesting instead of telling. So that's kind of what I was trying to do there. And I'm just adding some more cream consistency paint, and that's one of my favorite ways to get a lot of different kinds of textures, is to paint an area with milk or tea consistency, and then when it dries a little bit, go back in with cream consistency so that it kind of spreads softly, but it doesn't spread so much that you lose the shape of the thing you just painted. So that is a good technique to use when you're painting feathers, is to paint an area and then go right back in and add dark highlights while the paper is still soft. You just have to kind of time it right. You have to make sure the paper is not too wet, because then your dark paint strokes will just turn into blobs, and you don't want it too dry, because then they'll look like they're pasted on and they're hard edged. So that just takes some practice, and a lot of times you'll see me in my tutorials, you'll see me moisten an area and then put one little tiny dot of cream consistency paint to see if it spreads enough or if it's going to hold its shape enough, and then I go on to paint the rest of that area that I'm working on. So that's something that you can do, and I do that all the time. For the underside of this chicken and for some of these feathers, I painted negatively around the bottom parts of the feathers that were in shadow instead of painting the feathers themselves. So I painted the shadows instead of the feathers to kind of give them shape. And I'm trying to paint quite a few dark things around the front chicken's tail, so his tail stands out pretty well. Okay, now I'm painting the top of the front chicken's head. I'm using Napthol red for the red parts, and then for the head I'm using burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and I'm trying to paint that all together at one time, so parts of the red areas of the chickens, I don't know what they're called, the pieces parts, melt into the brown feathers so that they don't look glued on. And then I painted parts of the neck with pure burnt sienna, and then I went back in with cream consistency burnt sienna mixed with ultramarine blue, which makes pretty much a black. And then I negatively paint around some of these lighter feathers in the bottom part of her neck, which I can go in later and paint over those, but still those feather shapes will show through whatever I paint over that. So that was the plan at this point, was I would paint those negatively and then go in later and kind of fill them in and add more detail. And you can see I'm painting negatively around those grasses. I don't recommend it, but, and see here, I just put in a couple little dots to test out how wet my paper was and if it was wet enough to hold the shape of these kind of U-shaped feathers. And as you can see, the paper is just wet enough that it softens those little U-shaped feathers I'm painting now, but not so wet that they totally lose their shape. So that's kind of the trick to painting cream consistency paint into moist paper. You just have to wait until the paper is just the right amount of moistness. And here I'm painting the eye, which I ended up not liking. It didn't look like the chicken's eye at all. It looked too cartoonish and big and round, and later I'll go in and I'll completely erase it and fix it. So you'll see that in a little bit. And then I'm painting negatively around these grass shapes too. I'm painting clear water into the next section of the painting that I want to work on, and I'm going to add a bunch of burnt sienna to get the chicken to the next level of value, a medium value instead of what it is right now, which is a light value. So I'm pre-wetting my paper, and I work in sections like I usually do with most of my paintings. I put in clear water, and then I go in with milk or tea consistency and then cream consistency. And here I'm painting the grasses, and you can see I was using big, bold gestural strokes for those grasses, and then I splashed a little bit of water and created some cauliflowering right down in there in the grasses. So that just keeps that kind of loose and gestural and painterly and pretty. And I made sure that most of the grasses that I painted pointed back in towards the chicken. And here I'm just going in with burnt sienna right now. I've got tea to milk consistency burnt sienna, and I'm painting the bottom part of that chicken. And plus I'm also getting that paper wet so that I can then go in and put in some darker details in the next step. But first I'm having to get this whole area wet, and I'm wanting the most of the darks of the grasses under the bird to melt into the bird. So that was a focus of painting underneath the chicken throughout this painting process. And there I'm working on her hind end area with pretty much straight lamp black, and I was letting it bloom and blossom out quite a bit just to get a soft feathery look. And those aren't important parts of the painting, so they could just kind of blur into the background and it would still look good. And I'm going into the bottom of the chicken now with that lamp black, and also just painting in some darks just to get those established in the painting. And you can see while this is wet, I'm going back in and I'm dropping in little tiny drops of clear water into these cream consistency kind of rings I created. So I would create a ring of cream consistency paint, and then inside the ring I would drop a little tiny bit of clear water and then let it disperse out. And that's one of the things I like about lamp black, is it's pretty granulating, so it does that push technique really nicely, that cauliflowering technique, and the little controlled cauliflower technique, which I call my push technique, really works well for feathers to create soft feather textures that look really painterly. So I did that quite a bit throughout this painting. By the way, if you want to see this tutorial in real time, it's, I don't know, close to 3 hours long, where you can see this all done in much better detail. Be sure to join my Patreon, which is only $5 a month, and for that $5 you get access to not only this tutorial, but you'll be able to access all the tutorials that I've done up to this point. I've got a horse, I've got a Irish landscape, some Siamese cats. What else did I do? I have to think about it, but anyway, there's several tutorials there with downloadable traceables with them. I am next going to work on the red parts of this front chicken's face. And so the first thing that I do is I use my round size 8 to moisten the whole area with clear water. And it is a small area, but I do want to keep this soft. So then I float in some Napthol red, and you can see just how the paint reacts where it's still dry, where I wanted hard edges and where I wanted to just stay soft. And just to give myself options, I do paint around some parts of the little details in her face so that it stays completely white for the time being. So if later I decide that I want to keep it white and have that little bit of sparkle, especially in her face, I can do that. So you can always paint over those white areas, but you can never get them back. So I'm using Napthol red, and if I need it to be a cooler area, like in a shadow, I can add ultramarine blue and or burnt sienna, but here I add some cream consistency Napthol red in that dark part of the hangy downy part just to suggest a fold. And there I've got lamp black mixed in with my Napthol red for the very dark area under her chin. And as you can see, I try not to let any part of a painting or section I'm working on be an island. So I try to find a way to connect whatever I'm working on to the rest of the painting. And in this case, I connected the dark areas under her chin back behind that longer white section, and shadows under her little clucky areas. So try to connect different parts of the painting together in that way. And here I'm working on her beak, and I'm keeping it a pretty grayed down orange. I don't want it to scream bright orange beak. That's not the point of this painting. And then I'm going to work on this smaller, very back chicken, and these are tiny, tiny little details. And so I'm just painting on completely dry paper so that I can maintain as much control as possible in such small areas. And the first thing I do is kind of just map out where the main structures of the face are so that I can then go in and fill everything else in. And the line of her beak continues on under her eye, so that's what that red line is that goes under her eye. And then I'm negatively painting around those grasses with clear water because I'm going to go in next with some burnt sienna and a mix of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue to paint the dark colors of this chicken's feathers. And this doesn't need to be highly detailed because it is a very tiny chicken in the painting anyway, and it's not one of the main things that you're going to be paying attention to anyway. And here I'm just going in with tea to milk consistency burnt sienna to lay the foundation for the next layers that I'll float in while this is all wet. And here I've got a little bit more ultramarine blue in the mix, you can tell, because it's a cooler, darker brown, and it's getting close to cream consistency. Now I'm painting up over the top of her head with milk consistency, burnt sienna, and blending all these different values together as much as I possibly can. You can see how it's kind of difficult to negatively paint around those grasses, but I did want to situate her in the grasses so she's not a cutout, she's part of her environment, and that just makes everything look better. Then I'm going in with some permanent green light with a little bit of Winsor green gold mixed in for interest and just painting negatively around the chicken. And then I go in with some ultramarine mixed in to my brush to kind of make a darker area behind the chicken in the green and just add some different colors of green to keep it interesting behind that small chicken. And I try to keep my brush strokes as big and expressive as possible when I'm painting the grass. For the next little section, I went off camera and I'm so bummed because I just thought it was such a pretty effect. But basically what I did is I used ultramarine blue and I painted with the ultramarine blue in my brush straight across the chicken's neck there. You can see where that ultramarine blue is, and painted straight across it to kind of blur the edge of her neck with the background and just kind of connect it to the rest of her body. And now I'm going in with burnt sienna and adding yet another level of value to make her chest even darker. And I'll go in later with a scrubber to scrub out those light areas that are in the reference photo. And I knew that I would do that. Burnt sienna mixed with lamp black and or ultramarine blue are great candidates for that technique because they lift so well. So that was my plan, to go in later. And here I'm just wetting this area again so that I can go in and put more burnt sienna in over these areas, and then going in with cream consistency lamp black to get her underside really dark to create some dimension in space, and then painting those little U-shaped black feather shapes. And then I go in and dot here and there with clear water to use my push technique to get the middle of the feathers lighter and keep the undersides dark. And I paint negatively in the grasses beneath her to suggest grass, but keep it kind of abstract. And when I paint the grass, I try to use big gestural brush strokes to keep it painterly and interesting. All right, now I'm just wetting with clear water again for this next section. And do you guys notice a pattern? I work in sections, and I start most sections with a layer of clear water, and then I go in and put in my colors. And so here I'm putting in some cream consistency between the light areas of those feathers to really play up that push technique that I had used earlier. And this is a light area of her back where the light is hitting her, so I want to keep this area really light, and then the edges have really nice dark darks. So I just paint in some random little black marks here to suggest feathers, but as you can see, I'm not exactly painting each and every feather. I'm just suggesting feathers with my brush strokes. Now I'm going in with some cream consistency burnt sienna just to add a little bit of color in here and a little bit of interest in letting it melt together, do the push technique, let it cauliflower a little bit. I go in with some cream consistency and then I'll go in with a little tiny drop of clear water and then kind of repeat that pattern a little bit randomly because I want the feathers to look random, but I also want to really take advantage of watercolor's beautiful ability to cauliflower and do that push technique because I think it works so well for feathers. Again, just to explain this push technique, for this area, I guess a good way to explain it is I drop in random bits of cream consistency paint, then I drop in little dots of clear water, and then I add some more cream consistency paint next to, not in those dots of water, but next to the dots of water, tiny dots of water. If they're too big, they'll take over too much and just blur everywhere. So very, very small dots of water next to dots of cream consistency paint. Repeat. And sometimes if you find that it's spreading too much, you can go in, wring out your brush, pick up some of the water off the paper, and then go back in with cream consistency paint, repeat until you like what you see. And now it's time in the painting when I'm starting to do the smaller details of this painting with some Napthol red there. I decided to not keep that little piece white. I wanted to tone it down a little bit, darken some of these darks in the face, get that back clucker area really red by using cream consistency floated into a wet area and using a combination of Napthol red and ultramarine blue to get that little fold in that little side spot behind, kind of where an ear would be if a chicken was a person. And just adding tiny little details, finishing up this head. Now I'm just gonna work on toning down these white spots in this middle chicken's neck. I decide that all those white spots are a little too overwhelming. I don't want this chicken to be the main point of interest. So I went in with some tea consistency paint on the neck and just toned all those white areas down, and that's kind of more true to the reference photo anyway, and so I think that looks better anyway. And then I'm just painting over some of the spots in the face with some more Napthol red to really pop out that red, and I think the green in the background really helps to pop these reds out as well. And then just add a little bit of detail to her tail. And then we'll finish up some of the details in this chicken's face, and it's really not important to get as much detail even as I did because this is a very insignificant chicken in this painting because she's so far away. She's just playing a supporting role, so you don't have to put a ton of detail, just enough to suggest the basic structures of her face. And here I'm going in with a combination of Napthol red and ultramarine blue to put in those dark areas, and then in the head area I'm using almost black with a combination of burnt sienna mixed with ultramarine blue. And again, I'm using my silver black velvet squirrel hair size 8 round, and it makes a beautiful point. It's a great brush for this kind of work. I highly recommend them if you have decided to commit to watercolors. They're not that expensive for what you get, and they make beautiful points, and they're just quite lovely to work with. And I'm just finishing the little tail details of this chicken and just keeping it really loose, starting with some clear water, then putting in some tea consistency burnt sienna, and then some milk consistency, and just kind of letting it kind of run all together and keeping it really loose. And getting that tiny little black dot of her eye. You really probably don't even need that, but this was a commission, so I was trying to get it pretty detailed. And those darks are what really pop out some of these areas and make them shine. So don't forget your darks and make sure you get your darkest darks really dark. And that's what ultramarine blue and burnt sienna are so good for. They really make a very nice dark. And I'm just adding some Napthol red, milk consistency. I'm not even worrying about it being on moist paper because this area is so small, it really won't matter. The main idea is to get a few little bright red areas in there that are pure red. And the beak is a combination of Quin gold and Napthol red, leaving a couple little tiny white areas on her face just to keep her fresh and to draw the eye a little bit because she is one of the main players in the painting, being a chicken and all. And here I'm going to go and just paint over some more of the white spots in this main chicken's face, just to stay true to the reference photo and also to make sure that I don't have too much jewelry in this painting because that would look overwhelming. Just like if a woman wears too much jewelry, it looks tacky. It's kind of the same idea with a painting. If you put too much jewelry in your painting, it looks overwhelming. But just a little bit of jewelry really makes it pop and really makes it stand out and look much more professional. For these dark red areas, again, I put a little bit of ultramarine blue in with my Napthol red. And I'm using this opportunity to put in some super dark areas like under her chin while the paper is a little bit damp. Her eye looks better. I fixed it. I made it smaller. And just getting those darks in now. And then I need to work on this one area of the painting that is not developed enough, so I'm getting it all wet with clear water, putting in lines of burnt sienna, keeping it really soft, and then making sure that I get my darks in, but not overdoing it. And then I go in with clear water and get everything softened up and wet. And again, just working this area like I did before, using some cream consistency paint, burnt sienna, then some cream consistency black, and then going in and putting in a dot here and there where the feathers are light with clear water, and then going in again and putting in a little bit more cream consistency, and then just kind of building it up until I'm happy with how it looks. Then I use my scrubber to go in and take out some areas of the feathers to make those light spots really pop out, and then I use a paper towel to blot them up. So I have my scrubber a little moist with clear water, and I go in and I scrub the little areas that I want to scrub up, and then I blot. And also, usually when I'm using my scrubber, I will also get the paper wet. So that is one of the techniques that I use usually almost in every painting I do, because those soft edges you get with a scrubber are just so lovely. Then you can see I painted some ultramarine blue over the front bird's tail feathers to just kind of incorporate her tail into the background and to make it look like it's pushed back in space to give her more three-dimensional quality. And I liked how that came out as well. And here I'm just painting in some final strokes of grass, and then using my scrubber again on this middle chicken to kind of bring out some feather textures and softening parts of the front chicken's face. And then I wanted her tail to pop out a little bit more, so I did this front chicken's tails with a little bit more detail and darks, just to really make it pop out a little bit more. And here I'm putting in those final darks that really make a painting pop. And then I think we're done. I'm signing it with my silver black velvet size 8 round, and here's the final painting. And I was so happy with how this came out. I loved how loose the background was. I loved how parts of the chicken feathers cauliflowered. I was really happy with how that came out. I liked how I incorporated the chickens into the background with those disappearing edges. Again, if you guys would like to see me paint this in more detail, the actual tutorial with a free downloadable traceable is available on my Patreon. It's only $5 a month, and for that $5 you get not just this tutorial but also other tutorials that I've done in the past couple months. And there's 3 or 4 other full tutorials along with a bunch of other goodies on there, including all the downloadable traceables and reference photos, my supply list, my full list of what all colors I have on my palette right now, and also access to a free reference photo group that I started on Facebook just for my Patreon students. So join me there, and I'd love to see you. Thanks so much, you guys. I'll see you on my next painting adventure. Bye.